the one with the key of David, who opens and no one shuts, and shuts and no one opens. Now, what does this mean? The key of David. Well, first of all, you may remember, if you go back, actually keep your finger here, go back to chapter 1 and verse 18. Jesus, when he first appeared to John, this is what he said. I am he who lives and became dead, and look, I am alive unto the ages of the ages. Amen. And I hold the keys, plural, of the grave and death. Now, what does that mean? Jesus says, I hold the keys of the grave and death. Well, when we went through that in chapter 1, I pointed out a statement that Jesus made back in John, I believe it was chapter 7, where he says that God, that his Father, had given him authority over life itself, and that in the resurrection it was Christ. He says that those who are in the graves will hear the voice of the Son of Man, and they will come forth. That is, Christ himself will call forth the righteous to come out of their graves, and by the power of God they are going to be resurrected. But it's going to be by the statement and the call of God, and we have been given an example of that, which was Lazarus, when Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead. He gave us sort of a little illustration of what that's going to look like, because it says he cried out with a loud voice, Lazarus, come forth! And Lazarus came forth out of his grave, right? Well, this is what's going to happen at the second coming of Christ. In 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, towards the end of the chapter there, it talks about how that Christ is going to come with a shout. And that shout is the command to come forth of the dead, the righteous dead, to come forth out of their graves. And then the power of God is going to resurrect the righteous dead, and they're going to come forth out of their graves. And then Paul goes on to say that, and then after they have come forth out of their graves, then he says, we who are alive and remain will be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air. That is, together with the dead who have just been raised, who have come out of their graves, and now they're standing on their feet. All the righteous will be standing on earth at that time. And then he says, we'll all be caught up together, both those just resurrected and those who are still alive, caught up together into the air to meet Christ at his coming, and to escort him back to earth, where he will establish his kingdom, and we will be given our inheritance in the coming kingdom. All right, so he's referred to here as the one having the key of David. Now, we just read in Revelation 1:18 that he has the key of death and the grave. That means he has the key to the resurrection. And the key, of course, is a symbol for having full authority, right? So Christ has been given full authority over the grave. That is, he's the one who decides who comes forth to inherit eternal life and who is left to be judged later and thrown into Gehenna. It's all based on Christ's decision, right? Now, who is he going to decide gets to come forth? Well, it's clear if you read John's Gospel that those who believe, those who are believing, and he uses a present participle there, are the ones that he will raise at the last day. Okay? Now, but he says here, what he refers to here is the key of David. Now, is that different than the keys of death and Hades? Yes, the keys of death and Hades is the key to the resurrection. The key of David is something different. Now, why David? Why David? Why is David mentioned here? And did David have a key? And notice it's a singular key. Well, he's referring to the covenant that God made with David, that one of his sons would reign upon his throne, that he would raise up the temple of God, and that his kingdom would never end. And we've talked about that quite a bit in this class. But is the key of David mentioned? Yes, it is. It's actually mentioned in Isaiah 22:22. So let's turn there for just a moment. In fact, this verse here in Revelation is quoting from Isaiah 22:22. right? He says, the key of the house of David I will lay on. Well, let's actually go back to verse 20 so we know who we're talking about. It shall be in that day that I will call my servant Eliakim, the son of Hilkiah. I will clothe him with your robe and strengthen him with your belt. I will commit your responsibility into his hand. He shall be a father to the inhabitants of Jerusalem and to the house of Judah. The key of the house of David I will lay on his shoulder, so that he shall open and no one will shut, and he shall shut and no one shall open. I will fasten him as a peg in a secure place, and he will become a glorious throne to his father's house. Now, what in the world is he talking about? All right, well, you have to have some context for Isaiah 22. What was going on in Isaiah 22? Well, what Isaiah was prophesying about here was something that had actually occurred during Isaiah's own lifetime. Isaiah prophesied during the reign of three kings, if I remember correctly, but one of them was King Hezekiah. And this you can read about this in 2 Kings chapters 18 and 19. We're not going to go there for time's sake, but if you want to get some of the context of what was going on, just go back later and read 2 Kings 18 through 19, and you'll get the backstory of what this prophecy is about. All right, but let me just give it to you in a nutshell. The Assyrian king had come down and threatened the northern kingdom of Israel. And remember, the southern kingdom was the kingdom of Judah. After Solomon, the kingdom of Israel was split in two, right? Because of a dispute over who was going to be king. And so the Assyrians had come down and threatened and then captured the northern kingdom of Israel and taken them off into captivity. It's called the Assyrian captivity. And now this is before Nebuchadnezzar came later and captured Judah, the southern portion. But the kings from the line of David through Solomon were in the southern kingdom, because that's where the temple was. That's where Jerusalem was, right? In the kingdom of Judah. Well, Hezekiah, who was king of Judah, he then, the Assyrian king, after he had captured the northern kingdom, he decided he's going to come down and capture the southern kingdom of Judah as well, where Hezekiah was king. Well, Hezekiah, he kind of cowered a little bit. The king of Assyria basically threatened him, and Hezekiah, instead of turning to God, instead of taking this threat to God, he sort of cowered before the Assyrian king. And so he said to the Assyrian king, whatever you want me to pay, I'll pay, and we'll obey you. Just don't, conquer us. Don't come in here with your armies. So he said, you just name your price and we'll pay you, so that you'll basically go away and leave us alone. And so the king of Assyria, he set a really high price in gold and whatnot. Well, Hezekiah, being naive as he was at this time, he decided he was going to pay King Hezekiah, sort of pay him off. And so in order to do that, they had to strip the gold and the silver. They had basically turn over all their wealth to the Assyrians, and he went so far as to strip the gold and the silver out of the temple of God, even stripping it off the doors and whatnot. He basically cleaned out God's house and the treasury, Judah's treasury, in order to give to this Assyrian king, thinking that will satisfy him, because he only wants to invade us because he wants our wealth, right? So let's give him the wealth, and then maybe we can kind of, pick it up from there and recover from that. And so that's what he did instead of relying on God to rescue him. Now, Hezekiah was not a bad king, all right? In fact, if you read 2 Kings, you'll see that he was honored by God, because he did not lead Israel into idolatry. In fact, he brought them out of idolatry to worship the true God. But here he wasn't really relying on God as he should have. Well, as the story unfolds, after they turned over all this wealth to the king of Assyria, then the king of Assyria basically said, okay, thanks for all your gold, but we're still going to invade you. And he sent his general down there, and they started his army, the Assyrian army, to surround Jerusalem, and they started basically telling, shouting, or maybe they had a megaphone, but shouting to the people in Jerusalem and the guards up on the wall that you need to come out and surrender and open the gates and let us in, because your God is not going to be able to deliver you from us. And so there was this waiting time that took place. Well, King Hezekiah, now he realizes that he made a terrible mistake. And so he now decides to send two of his messengers to Isaiah the prophet, who was alive in Israel at the time, or in Judah at the time, and send these messengers to him. Well, one of the two messengers that he sent to Isaiah the prophet was the man that's mentioned here in Isaiah 22. His name is Eliakim, the son of Hilkiah. And he was an official in Hezekiah's kingdom, along with another man named Shebna. Well, these two men went to went to Isaiah the prophet. Isaiah the prophet sent a message back with them to King Hezekiah. And apparently what happened was Eliakim advised the king rightly, right, that he should not submit to the Assyrians. But this other official, Shebna, advised the king poorly. Well, long story short, if you continue reading what happened there in 2 Kings, Hezekiah took the letter that the Assyrian king had sent. He sent this letter. And he took the message from Isaiah, and he went into the temple of God, and he took the letter and he laid it before God, and he wept, and he asked God to deliver them, which is what he should have done in the first place, to deliver them from the hand of the Assyrians. Well, God heard his prayer, and God honored him for his prayer, and honored him for listening to the good advice that he got from Isaiah through this man, Eliakim. And God sent his destroying angel into the camp of the Assyrians, and he basically wiped them out overnight. And in fact, the text says that in the next morning, there they were, all these dead corpses in the Assyrian army, and the few that were left, they obviously panicked, and they fled, and they ran back all the way back to Assyria. And then the king of Assyria, he went into the temple of his god, and he was murdered by his own people in the temple of his god. And so God saved King Hezekiah and the nation of Israel, or Judah, at that time by the hand and the good advice that this man Eliakim brought to King Hezekiah. And so here in Isaiah 22, if you go back to Isaiah 22, verse 20, it says, "Then it shall be in that day that I will call my servant Eliakim, the son of Hilkiah, I will clothe him with your robe." And that was with the robe of Shebna, the man who offered bad advice. In other words, God was saying, I'm going to take the authority from him and I'm going to give it to you. And I'm going to put you in his place as basically second to the king. And he says, I will clothe him with your robe. I will strengthen him with your belt. I will commit your responsibility into his hand. He shall be a father to the inhabitants of Jerusalem and to the house of Judah. The key of the house of David I will lay on his shoulder, that is, on Eliakim's shoulder. In other words, and in doing so, he was making Eliakim second in command only to the king Hezekiah over all of Judah. All right, now this is what happened back then. Now, why does Jesus then say in Revelation chapter 3, verse 7, that he is the one with the key of David? And he uses the very same clause. Well, he's doing what Revelation does repeatedly, and that is look back into the Old Testament and take a historical situation that occurred in the Old Testament and make an application of it to the future. Well, what is the application of it? Well, just like Eliakim was righteous and he was given the key to the kingdom of David, right? The kingdom of David Hezekiah, King Hezekiah was of the line of David. He was the king, the ultimate king, but Eliakim was given the place under him of having authority over his whole kingdom. And so that's what the key of David represented. That is this full and total authority over everything under the king himself. Well, Christ has that same kind of authority under the Father. See, the Father is the ultimate sovereign, but Christ has been given all authority under the Father. That is, the authority he has comes from the Father. It's not authority that is inherent to his own person. It's authority that's granted to him by the Father. And this is an important point, because those who are Trinitarians teach that there are three co-equal, co-eternal persons that make up God, right? There's one God, supposedly, that is three persons, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, and that these three are allegedly co-eternal, that is, they have always existed side by side, and co-equal, that is, they all have equal authority. Well, the Bible doesn't teach that at all right? Not at all. In fact, the Father is the one with ultimate authority, and the Son's authority comes from what is delegated to him by the Father. And that's true in the Old Testament prior to the incarnation, and it's true in the New Testament when Christ became man and came to earth, and it's also true in the kingdom when Christ rules over the nations. His authority comes from the Father. I want to just look at a couple of passages really quick that show this clearly. All right, so go to Matthew chapter 28, verse 18. Matthew 28:18, you probably recognize this from the Great Commission. It says, "And Jesus came and spoke to them," that is his disciples, saying, quote, "All authority has been given to me in heaven and on earth. Go therefore and make disciples of all the nations," etc. All right. All authority has been given to me. Not all authority is mine. Not all authority exudes from me. No, all authority in heaven and earth has been given to me. Notice, has been given is in the passive voice. That is, someone else has given that authority to me, and that, of course, is the Father, right? Now, if you go to John chapter 3, verse 35, it says, this is the words of John the Baptist. He says, "The Father loves the Son and has given," notice also the passive voice, "the Father loves the Son and has given all things into his hand." Given all things into his hand. This is the passing on of authority. Go over to John chapter 13, verse 3. It says, "Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands, and that he had come from God and was going to God." The Father had given all things into his hands. Again, this is the passing of authority. And one more passage back in Matthew. I should have read that one first, actually. Go back to Matthew chapter 11 and verse 27. "All things have been delivered to me by my Father. And no one knows the Son except the Father, nor does anyone know the Father except the Son, and the one to whom the Son wills to reveal him." See, again, Christ is always portrayed in both in the Old Testament when he appears to Abraham, or he appears to others in the Old Testament, or he appears to Moses in the burning bush, or whatever. He is always relaying God's words. He's always the one whom God sends, and always the one to whom God has granted authority to speak on his behalf. And in the New Testament, when Christ comes, it's the same way. In the kingdom, it's the same way. The Father is always the ultimate authority, never the Son. The Son is the ultimate authority under the Father. All right, that's a key point that you need to have straight in your head. It's not co-equal authority. All right. Now,